Okay guys, so the next step is going to be removing the crankshaft from the engine. Now one thing that you'll notice on our little 3-liter Ford here is that Ford has incorporated all of the main caps into one solid piece here. This whole piece comes off and it's called a bed plate. The reason they did this is because they wanted to tie all the mains together and make the bottom of the end stronger and more rigid. Because this is all one piece, there is a detorque sequence on this, and it's important that you follow it. In your service manual, you will notice that you will find in the disassembly area a detorque sequence. It is very important that you follow the detorque sequence as you take the crankshaft out. Before you take the crank out, crankshaft end play is going to be checked with a dial indicator and a magnetic base. Now, when you did your cylinder heads, we talked earlier about how we had to put a magnetic plate on here because the engine is not magnetic. One nice thing about the main cap up here is this is a steel cap, and so what we can do is we can take our indicator, and our indicator magnet will attach right to that cap and stay on there. At that point, then you just need to adjust your dial indicator so that you get your indicator up against the end of the crank, and you want to be in the travel of that indicator. So you want to put this stylus about in the middle so we can check movement, because what we're doing here is we're checking crankshaft end play. The crankshaft has to move forward and backward. You just want to find a spot in between the crank here, and you want to pry that crank back and forth. And what you're going to find is that on your indicator you will see the movement. So as we pry the crank back and forth, you will be able to measure the movement of that crankshaft. So what you want to do is zero out your dial indicator here. Once you get that on 0, then you can just push the crank back and forth, and you can see that we have end play. This is the crank moving back and forth this way. The crankshaft has to have movement. If you ever put one of these together, or you're ever diagnosing one of these and you don't have any end play, that's a huge red flag. Everything needs to stop, and you need to figure out why it doesn't have clearance. So that is your end play right there. Once you check your end play, you can remove your dial indicator and you are ready to remove your crankshaft. So like we said earlier, you want to follow the detorque sequence. Now, we have already loosened all of these bolts here off camera, so we don't really have anything torqued. So now it's just a matter of, once you get everything detorqued in sequence, then you can just take your speed handle, your speed wrench or whatever, and you can remove all the bolts. One thing that you need to do, so once you get all of your bolts loose, go ahead and leave the bolts in here. Now we're missing a few because this is a classroom demo engine. Yours will have all the bolts in it. Once you detorque them in sequence, get them all out. Don't pull these bolts out like this and lay them on your bench. Go ahead and leave these bolts in the bed plate, and that way they stay organized. You got a lot of different bolts in this thing. You got bolts of different sizes. You got bolts that have studs on them for your windage tray. So you want to keep those in their respective locations, and that helps you keep the bolts organized for when you reassemble the engine. At that point, then you're just going to gently pull up on your bed plate, lift off of the engine. So this is your bed plate. Again, I kept my bolts in there, and you can go ahead and just set this up on the bench like that and leave the bolts in it. So we'll set that aside. We're just going to set this over on the bench like so, and that way it's out of the way and we can move on. Now for crankshaft removal, you have a rear main seal here, and this is a one-piece seal. You want to go ahead and take that off. And then on the crank itself, there's a pilot hole in the back. If you put a couple fingers in the back and you grab it in the front here, you can pull the crank straight up out of there. It's not that heavy. One person can do it. And then again, you set this aside on your bench. And you want to set it up on its end, but keep it away from the edge where it's going to get knocked off. And you just can, temporarily, you can just store that crank sitting up like that. And that is crankshaft removal.